So today I am painting this Kingfisher. So I'm starting off getting some of my light blue paint and adding some water to it. I'm using just one brush, and that is my water brush, but I am dipping it in water. I'm not using the water inside the brush. So I'm starting this bird off with wet on dry. So usually I like to do wet on wet, but decided to do this one a little differently, and I am just putting the wet paint directly onto the dry paper. My cat is joining me for this one, if you can hear her. I'm just putting that light blue color all over the top of the head. Adding just a little more there. And you can see I'm dotting some of it on to go ahead and start creating a little texture on this little bird. Cleaning my brush off. Going in with a little bit of black and a little bit of darker blue, adding it to that lighter blue I already had on my palette. Drying my brush off, just picking up some paint there. And I am dotting that on. I'm dotting that onto the wet paint, or I should say the damp paint that is on the head still. So just dotting that all on the top of the head and down the back a little bit. Kingfishers have some beautiful texture on them, and that is what I'm starting to try and create. So adding a little black there to my color on my palette, a little more of my dark blue. So then going in with that even darker color now and dotting that on as well. So grabbing some of my lighter blue color, and adding that there on the back of the bird. And this is a very thick lighter blue, so there's not a lot of water added to it. And I'm taking some of that same color and dotting that onto the head as well. Adding that lighter blue color there on the side, on top of the wing. Just adding that first layer of color there on the wing. This is all in that same light blue color. Getting a little more of that color, adding it to that section underneath the eye. Picking up some of my darker color that was still on my palette and dotting that in. And then just going into the darker blue color and dotting some of that. That is very thick paint there with very little water. And adding some of my darker blue color there above the wing. Back into that darker color I had mixed on my palette and putting a little bit of that in there. Just going into my dark blue color on my palette. Getting plenty of that paint ready. And adding a little bit of the light blue to it until I get the color I want. And of course the hair. Notice I get a lot of hairs in my paintbrush because I have 2 dogs and 2 cats, and it's just inevitable that I have animal hair everywhere. So I'm going through and with that color that I mixed, the dark blue with the light blue, and I'm adding some of that to the wing and also doing some of those lines, some of those detail lines with that color. I'm just putting this in with kind of fast and loose strokes here. Being a little more careful on those detail lines of the wing. Adding some more paint to the palette, mixing up that same color, the dark blue and the light blue. And essentially just doing the same thing, adding some of the detail lines with it on the tail now. And some more on the wing. Just going over those detailed feather lines a little more, going over the top a little more. Now I'm going across. These birds have a lot of color and a lot of texture to them, so I'm going across some of these feathers to add some of that detail with that darker color. And just pulling some of that color around now. And adding some salt. You don't have to use the grinder. It's just what I had near me. Just any kind of table salt. And I'm putting that on to add texture to the bird. So you will need to experiment a little bit. You don't want the paint too wet and you don't want it too dry. It has to be just right for this to work. So while that part is drying, I got some orange and I'm going to start putting that on the neck. So again, kind of doing some, a little bit of stippling. To start adding a little bit of a textured look. Going into a little bit of my brown. And dotting that in, stippling that into some areas of the orange. And that way, since the two paints are wet, they will mix a little bit on the paper. Back to my orange now, taking that down the chest a little more. Pulling that down onto the belly at this point. You see there's not a lot of paint on my brush now. I'm just still kind of pulling at what I have, which is why the color is looking lighter down there. Tiny bit more paint, not a lot, because I want to keep that color light. As you can see, I have left some white spots there on the chest. Just letting some of the white of that paper show through. And now going along the wing with some of my brown to just create a little more separation of the wing from the body. And going in with a very slightly damp brush, and I'm just blurring that line out a little bit and blurring some of my other lines. Anywhere I see a place where it looks kind of like a harsh line, then I will go ahead and blur that out a little bit. Going into my brown, adding a little more of that for a little more variation. A little more around that wing. Back to my orange. So as you can see, I am not letting my hand rest on the paper because what is underneath my hand is wet. So I am keeping my hand off the paper. Alternatively, you could let all of that dry before you take your orange and go in to do around the eye. Picking up some of that darker color I had mixed earlier. If you don't have any, you can mix some more up. It was both of my blues and a little bit of black, just to make a dark color there. And I'm being careful to not touch my orange, because if those two touch, they will bleed. And I did not want those two bleeding into each other. Picking up some more of that dark color I had mixed earlier, just mixing it all together. Adding a little more black, a little more dark blue, a little more black again, and a little purple. Just mixing until I get the color I want. There, adding a little more dark blue. Turning my paper, I always find it easier to work on the beaks if I turn my paper. Just following some of those lines there on the beak. So that is the top part of the beak. I'm picking up some more of that color that I mixed for the beak actually, and adding some more dotted layers to the head, because I really want these to stand out. If you look at a picture of a kingfisher, you can see those colors and those textures on their heads very well, at least on the pictures I've looked at. I've never, well, I think I saw a kingfisher in a zoo once. We do not have kingfishers where I live, so I've really not seen many in person, so I kind of have to rely on looking at photos of them. So went in with some light blue, and I'm dotting that there next to that darker color I just put on the head. But it's always good to look at different pictures at different angles and different light to get an idea of what the bird looks like that you're painting. Even then, sometimes I decide to do things a little differently, or I interpret things a little differently. Each time I paint a bird, I will kind of do it differently, even if it's the same sketch. So going in with some brown there, right on the top of that beak. Back to my dark color I had mixed for the beak. And there I am, letting those two colors meet a little bit. So with my darker beak color there, drying my brush off a little bit. You can see I added a little bit of orange to that darker color that I had mixed. So that was a little bit of orange to that beak color, and I am applying that to the under part of the beak. And if the top part is not dry and you do touch, those two colors could blend together. And I'm adding a little brown here to this part of the beak. So if you are worried about that, you may want to let it dry. So I'm back to that darker beak color that I made, adding some of that now. I am leaving, as you can see, a little line between the top and the bottom part of the beak. So back into my orange there, and I've run out of mixing space, so I'm just putting it where I can. And a little red added to my orange. And I'm down doing the feet now with that color. You see, I started out and decided I wanted a little more red, so I just added a little more red and then went back in. Putting a little black on my palette with the previous colors that I have on there, adding a little purple, and doing that very bottom part there. Right at the base of that tail. With that same color, going in, adding a few more feather details. Adding a little bit more to the tail there with that same color. Taking that color back onto some spaces on the wing. And that same dark color now, right on the side of that wing. back up to the eye area with the dark color that I had just mixed. And at this point, everything around the eye is dry. That way my colors should not bleed together. And more of the dark color, defining the bottom of that beak a little more. Going into my brown. And I am just stippling that onto the chest area there. Just going here and there. Some more brown around the base of that wing and on the bottom of the bird there. Taking a look now, looking at my painting, looking to see what's dry. Sometimes I have to tilt it into the light to see which parts are dry, which parts are wet. So getting some of my blue, my light blue, I'm adding, as you can see, just some long strokes of that lighter blue color on the top of that wing. And on the back there, on some of the wing itself, on the tail. So I'm going back into my brown, mixing a little of that with what's already on my palette, which was that darker color, the black, blue, and purple. And I'm adding a little bit of black to that brown now. And going in to do the eye. So everything should be dry before going in to do your eye, everything around your eye that is, so that the colors don't bleed out of the eye. And I also always try and leave the white of the paper showing through for the shine. And as you can see, I've left some other white areas on the chin and near the eye, and that is just the white shining through from the paper. And I'm going in and just stippling in a little bit, trying to just blur a few of those lines a little, going with a tiny bit of my dark blue paint and stippling that in to add some of those dots, adding some texture, blurring some other things as I go. So going in with my black now and adding the little toenails. Picking up the dark color I have on my palette And I am just going to create a shadow under this bird. Since this bird does not have a perch, I didn't want him to look like he was just floating on the paper, so I decided to just add a little bit of a shadow. So just taking a slightly damp brush and now blurring out some of those lines. Just a little. I'm not trying to remove them completely, I'm just trying to soften them a little bit. Just picked up a little bit of brown, adding that up there by the eye area. I think that was just a drip from my paintbrush that I was removing. A little more brown. Just adding a little bit more around that eye area. Picking up some black. And just going around that eye a little bit more. Darkening that eye a little bit. And that is it for this little bird.